May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all our hearts be always acceptable in your sight. O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. The Jewish leaders are after Jesus again. In today's gospel, they gather around him, demanding to know who he is. The cause for this fracas is the fact that Jesus has healed a man blind from birth. Not believing what their eyes have seen, these leaders have gone first to the man, and then to his parents, and then back to the man, demanding to know if he was really blind. The man finally, in exasperation, says, I only know one thing. I was blind, and now I can see. It so enrages the Jewish leaders that they drive the man out of town, and they seek out Jesus in the temple and say, tell us who you are. If you're the Messiah, tell us plainly. In this case, Jesus responds rather patiently. He says, you know, the deeds that I do show who I am. What I do comes from the Father. And then he adds something that's not designed to win friends and influence people. He says, you don't know who I am because you're not my sheep. My sheep know my voice. I know them, and they follow me. In other words, you don't get it. Leave me alone. Pondering this passage, I was struck with the statement, my sheep hear my voice. You see, I don't know about you, but I have a good deal of trouble hearing God's voice in my own life. And I wrote a sermon, I think it was a pretty good sermon. A sermon that I really wanted to give this morning, but I'm not going to give that sermon today. Perhaps another day. You see, the events of April 15th, last Monday, intervened. That Boston bombing shattered the sermon I prepared. As we watched those events unfold, some of us may have asked ourselves, how can this happen? Where is God in all of this? That, my brothers and sisters, is what I want to talk with you about this morning. You see, I believe that God was present in Boston, and that God speaks to us today in and through that tragedy. We don't know much about the two brothers who planted those bombs. We may never know their motives fully, but experience with too many events like this in our history has taught us two things. First, whatever they say about why they did it, the remaining brother says about what he did, why they did it, they will say that some ideology, some cause, some issue, some alleged religious truth impel them to act. They will act, they will say, in words of some sort or another, because some sort of God called them to act. In fact, people kill each other in the name of God every day. Christians kill Muslims, Muslims kill Christians, Christians kill Jews, Christians kill each other in the name of a God who calls us to love one another. The perpetrators will claim they are teaching us a lesson or giving us a message. They will believe that they are acting for some God or another. My brothers and sisters, they are not acting for the God who often we gather around. The second thing we know about these men, something about their motive, is that at the base and root, it will stem from fear and anger. We've seen it time and time again. The 9/11 bombers were told to hate and fear the United States and its influence in the world. When Timothy McVeigh parked that truck loaded with explosives outside the Memorial Building 18 years ago this week, he feared the power of the federal government we the people, and he was deeply angry at the way the government had handled the Branch Davidian standoff in Waco. The list goes on and on and on. A Again, we see that anger and fear lead human beings to kill and hurt each other thousands of times every day. Still, in the midst of the human suffering and destruction in Boston last week, I caught glimpses, as you did as well, of people responding to the voice of God, that God we know and worship. Although I usually don't watch the footage of violent events on TV, I did see the footage of the immediate end of the marathon, and what I saw were people wedging their way between barricades, climbing over barricades, tearing the barricades down to get to people who were bleeding and suffering. Remember the situation. 2 bombs had gone off. There could be snipers. They didn't know what was going to happen. But, disregarding their fear and disregarding their own safety, they went over those barricades to hold the hands of people who were suffering, to apply tourniquets that saved lives, and to reassure the suffering that more help was on the way. The EMTs that went to that scene to carry people to the emergency room, they would say they were doing their job. It was just their responsibility. But my brothers and sisters, that job and that responsibility stems from a compassionate God who calls us to take care of one another, to soothe suffering wherever we can. In the emergency rooms in Boston, doctors and nurses and med tech and custodians worked to take care of the suffering. Surgeons stood for long hours at operating tables, making the agonizing decision to take a limb to save a life. They did not check insurance funds. They did not worry about payments. They only acted out of a call to care for those who suffer, to love one another. Time magazine told of a young Jewish physician, Eric Fine. He was a surgical resident at Massachusetts General. He had a rare day off and was watching the marathon from the roof with some friends of his. When they heard of the event, they left, rushed to the emergency room, and they had one question: what can we do to help? And all of the SWAT teams and law enforcement officers who moved in to assure the safety of the people who were left and to try to find the perpetrator, they acted selflessly and courageously. Whether they are Muslims or Jews or Christians or agnostics or atheists, whether they acknowledge it or not, each one of those brave and compassionate people heard the voice of God. The voice of God calling them to love one another. Yes, I think God was present and active in the midst of these tragedies. Regardless of what the perpetrators claim, God did not lead them to make those bombs, but God called all of those who responded so quickly, saving far more lives than were lost. Those people responded with love and compassion to acts that were generated through fear and anger. Mary Ann Buddy, the Bishop of the Diocese of Washington, in her blog this week, gave thanks for all those first responders who acted so quickly. She wrote, "In times such as these, they are God's hands and feet and heart. And in their unassuming way, they show us how we should act when the unthinkable happens." But I think there is a call for us here in Ellicott City and this church this morning in all of this. Almost a year ago, this community had its own tragedy, the loss of 3 lives Sunday morning. Through God's grace, and only through God's grace, this community responded with generosity, kindness, and love. Through God's grace, and only through God's grace, this community moved toward reconciliation. Still, through our own tragedy and this recent one, God speaks to us again, asking us to examine our individual, collective hearts and minds. God asks us to look to see whether we harbor anger and fear that will lead us to plant small bombs in our relationship with each other and in our lives together. Unfortunately, this week in Washington, I think we saw the power and influence of fear in our national political life. I was deeply disappointed when the Senate of the United States failed to pass the most modest of measures to stem gun violence in this country. I stand with the bishop of this diocese and with the National Episcopal Church in calling for more measures to control gun violence. The majority of the American people want some sort of legislation. But listening to the Kojo Nambi show on Friday, I heard Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia report of his efforts to persuade his colleagues to vote for that modest bill. And he said, you know, the majority of the American people supported that bill. But my colleagues, they acted out of fear. Fear of the power of a very powerful lobby. Fear of losing their primary elections. And fear of losing their very comfortable Senate seats if fear stalks the halls of our Senate this week. But I was also deeply disappointed in the responses of some people on the other side. Patricia Nash, you may remember her. She was a hero in the event in Tucson. Gabriel Geffert was wounded. She tackled the man who was doing the shooting, thereby probably saving a number of lives. She was in the Senate chamber observing the action. In an interview afterwards, she said, "They have no soul." Whatever my disappointment with those senators, and however much I disagree with them, and one of them is from my home state, my brothers and sisters, they do have souls. They are God's beloved children, just as we are, regardless of where we stand on this issue. When we respond in anger to those senators whose views differ from ours, as Ms. Nash did, we are not heeding God's voice, a voice that always and ever calls us to love one another. But I think that God speaks to us in our individual lives through these events as well. God calls us to consider prayerfully and honestly where we harbor the seeds of anger and fear in our hearts. If we are honest with ourselves, we will find corners where small resentment festers, fear lingers, and anger simmers. A small slight that stuns and causes us to hold a grudge. A difference in political views that makes us distrust or even attack, as Ms. Nash did, those on the other side. A clinging to doing things our way because we fear losing control. Fear change. Those are all normal human reactions, but all are grounded in fear and anger, not love. My brothers and sisters, if you remember only one thing I say today, please hear this. God never calls us to act in anger and fear. God only, ever, and always calls us to love and care for one another. The call of God to us in these tragedies is twofold. First, we are to give thanks for those who responded so bravely and generously. Those who heeded God's call to care for others, even if they don't acknowledge that call. Second, we need to guard our hearts and minds from falling into fear and anger that led to these terrible events, and that will lead to other terrible events in our lives. Fear and anger produce death and destruction. In his last meal with his disciples, Jesus gave them a new and final commandment. He said to them, I give you a new commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. By this the world will know you are my followers, that you love one another. In the aftermath of this tragedy, may we seek compassion and justice, not acting out of fear and a desire for vengeance. Today, as every day, the Good Shepherd calls us his sheep to love one another.